A little bit about IoT devices. Essentially, what an IoT device is it connects to the internet. It spans a lot of industries. So the things that we kind of see include consumer IoT, commercial IoT, industrial IoT, infrastructure IoT, and military IoT. In 2020, there were around 31 billion IoT devices worldwide, and the global spending seems to reach around $1.4 trillion. In 2019, IoT devices generated around 500 zettabytes of data, according to Cisco. That's around 500,000 gigabytes or terabytes of data. Essentially, IoT devices, we see them all around us nowadays with Alexas and with Google Homes and all of these devices. And they're different things that we're really seeing emerge in our society as one of the bigger and more emerging technologies. An IoT device exactly essentially is an Internet of Things device. They're essentially smart devices that connect to the internet and allow us to transmit information through the internet within these devices. Essentially, they improve the functionality of regular common devices and connect hardware to the network. We see kind of a lot of these examples with just normal things we see day to day. I think many of the common examples that most of us know about are the IoT smart home devices that we see in our homes with the smart thermostats or the smart speakers and devices like the Echoes and the Google Homes, because those essentially connect speakers to the internet and allow us to do a lot of functionality and features. The same as the thermostat, which allows us to control the thermostat through our phone or change things through the internet. We also see them now in different things like smart fridges and microwaves and toasters and things along the line of that. And essentially, these IoT devices are just anything at all that can connect to the internet and be able to do kind of the functional things that we see from a computer. With there being such an increase in IoT devices in the consumer's hands nowadays, one of the things that have become really prevalent are IoT attacks. They have a rapidly growing attack surface, and over 70% of IoT devices contain serious vulnerabilities, according to HP. The way that hackers take advantage of IoT devices is by accessing their lack of security in internet security. Essentially, what ends up happening is with IoT devices, because they're such low level pieces of hardware that are connected to things that are already made, they essentially don't have the same security you'd see in a phone or a computer, making them really vulnerable to very simple types of attacks. So many times, hackers try to get onto someone's network through these IoT devices so that they can kind of access more important kind of devices such as someone's computer or server or things along the line of that. And essentially, that's how they get into things and devices. When you really think about it logically, when people make things like smart toasters and smart fridges, they don't make them within the mind of having the ability to kind of protect itself on the ports and on the networks. And because they're such low level devices, they don't have the correct hardware to be able to protect themselves from these kinds of attacks, which is why it's really important for people to stay vigilant as to what can happen with these IoT attacks. A few real life examples of IoT attacks are some of the following. One of the biggest ones that happened recently was the Mirai botnet. This was essentially a botnet that would look for vulnerable IoT devices anywhere and then add them to the botnet by seeding them and making them essentially and infecting them with this malware, the Mirai malware. And what essentially this would do is it would create its own botnet by infecting a new device, and that device would go and find more devices and more devices, and it's kind of spread. And this was actually really, really big because it caused large portions of the internet to go down, such as Netflix, YouTube, Reddit, Twitter, and a lot more other large websites because of this botnet. All of this happened because IoT devices were just being taken advantage of. Another example is the Jeep hack. In 2015, people were able to get like basic functionality of the Jeep by getting into the vehicle's CAN bus. And so some new firmware updates that were happening were being exploited over the Sprint cellular network, and it allowed people to essentially control common functionality such as going forward and going backwards, accelerating, braking, and some things that are very important to the car. And another really big kind of attack that's been done through IoT devices are cardiac devices. St. Jude's Hospital had cardiac devices that hackers were able to get into and access them through the transmitter. And this would allow them to start and stop these transmitters and be able to change things and get information from them
For this slide, I would like to go through the vulnerability of the IoT attack, and basically it's about 10 vulnerability about this attack. So first of all, it's weak guessable passwords. We know that most of IoT devices come with preset credential, and the most of the credential are usually proto focused, public available, or unchangeable credential, and that may include like the backdoors in firmware or client software that grants unauthorized access to deploy the system. And the second one is unsecure network service. One of the core feature of IoT devices involves networking capability that allowed endpoints to communicate amongst themselves over a secure internet connection. When insecure network services are running on devices, sensitive data can be compromised and authentication process can be bypassed. And third one is unhealthy IoT ecosystem. When IoT devices are integrated with the centralized management platform and legacy system, users can unknowingly introduce secure vulnerabilities at the application layer. This includes compromised authentication control, weak encryption protocols, and unoptimized input-output filtering. And fourth is inefficient update mechanism. To prevent IoT devices from being compromised, company must be able to send a real-time update to each endpoint as soon as they are made available. Without the trust from the firmware validation, patch delivery, and security monitoring, IoT devices could be running outdated version with glaring code vulnerability. And fifth is use of the insecure or outdated components. This could include like the insecure customize of the operating system platform and the use of third-party software or hardware components from the compromised blockchains. And six is the lack of privacy protection. IoT devices often collect and store users' personal information, which may be compromised if hackers are able to bypass built-in security feature and authentication protocols. The broader IoT system, including data store and API interface, can also be leveraged to store sensitive data unless properly secured. And seven is improper data transfer and storage. Even the most robust IoT equipment can be exploited if users fail to encrypt the data within their IT ecosystem. Sensitive information can be stolen at the point of the collection. While it's in transit or during processing, this accounts for why access control are considered a top priority when managing a fleet of the interconnected IoT devices. And eighth is lack of the devices management. So this means the lack of the security sports on devices deployed in production, which include like the asset management, update management, secure decommissioning, system monitoring, and the response capabilities. And the 9 is insecure default setting. This means the device or system shipped with insecure default setting or lack of ability to make the system more secure by restricting operator from the modifying configuration. And last one, the lack of physical hardening. So that means the lack of the physical hardening measures, allowing a potential attack to gain sensitive information that can help in the future remote attack or take local control of the devices. Inside this slide, I will go over the mitigation of the IoT attack. So first of all is security and privacy by design. IoT manufacturers have been a perceived compromise between the speed of the bring a product to market and the robustness and security of the system. The IoT devices become popular recent decades, so the security wasn't considered a priority requirement. However, we have seen a growing focus on privacy following high-profile data breaches and new data regulation, so that security should be paramount in design of new IoT devices, and continuously measures must be put in place to maintain and improve the security of both new and existing devices. Secondly, best practice of the cybersecurity can help the mitigation of the IoT attacks. So as users themselves, whatever individual, company, or the public sectors have a responsibility to adopt best practice when it comes to cyber awareness or education critical. Organizations need to balance the desire for the connectivity and the efficiency that IoT technology offers with the risk that such connectivity creates particularly given the lack of the emphasis on security in development of such products. And in the same way as an individual would manage a traditional operating system, we should play an active role in shaping company policy and on IoT and devices and be responsible up to date on threats facing their business. So there are also some syntax that we can use for the mitigation of the IoT attacks, such as using strong passwords or security keys, update regularly, monitoring devices and systems to detect and responsible to security events, and continuously update security of devices with the downloads of software patches from the manufacturers.
All right, so we're going to go a little further into some examples of how you can mitigate IoT attacks. So to start off with, if you can do like an audit of a network, so this is more from like a company's perspective, but if you can audit your network and determine, typically like with a pen testing team or something, determine which IoT devices are more vulnerable, or some companies even opt to put all IoT devices onto a separate network that is isolated from the core network. That way, if they do happen to get infected, they can't infect some of the more important infrastructure or some of the more important IoT devices and cause a bigger issue. We also have things like regularly update these devices. The manufacturers regularly push out updates that have security patches and a lot of other important things like that in them. So keeping your devices as up to date as possible just extremely minimizes the risk of an attack. You can also encrypt your traffic. So this is more so from the standpoint of primarily like cell phones, mobile devices like iPads, things like that. Using a VPN will encrypt your traffic to the VPN server. That way, your online browsing session is more private. You don't have to worry about attacks coming through, or any sort of malware gaining access to your device and using it for anything like that. And also just regularly updating your passwords and keeping a strong password regulations, just to keep them stronger, so they're not easy things like 123 password or just password or your last name. If you use passwords that are a bit stronger and actually have some meaning to them, some beef to them, it definitely minimizes the risk and just mitigates a lot of those opportunities. In terms of actual regulations regarding IoT devices and their security, there are relatively few, and they are pretty far between. The primary one that I'd like to touch on is an IoT security law that was passed in California in the beginning of 2020. It took effect on January 1st, which just touches on security requirements and a few things that are considered reasonably secure. And a lot of people are a bit worried about regulations like this and laws like this because a lot of the language that they use is pretty vague. So anything that falls under this law is defined as any device or other physical object that is capable of connecting to the internet directly or indirectly, and that is assigned an internet protocol address or Bluetooth address. Now, because that's such an extremely broad definition, a lot of people are worried about the implications of how companies will be able to keep up with those regulations and things when a lot of things may not necessarily fall under, like a cell phone or, a smartwatch, definitely, but like a dedicated home computer or a server, maybe not as much, depending on what kind of regulations they're putting in place. Now, the primary thing that has been out so far in terms of any sort of regulations is really just a list of suggestions from the National Institute of Standards and Technology. They actually have out a whole a document that writes out a lot of different regulations and things that will help both post-consumer and pre-consumer, before and after the consumer gets it, just how to keep it secure and things. but they're not actually required. They're just kind of we recommend doing this if possible. And so I think going forward, we will see a lot of legislature being put into place and a lot of regulations being passed by various different companies and governing bodies that will definitely secure IoT devices further, and definitely crack down on the security when it starts coming into IoT devices being used within the federal realm and things like that.
My name is John Reddy, and I'm going to talk to you guys about the future options that IoT has from a security standpoint. So firstly, I'd like to say it's extremely important that manufacturers and developers keep security as a priority in their mind while building these devices. IoT devices are technically endpoint devices, so they do require end-to-end security. But what is also important is that security is adaptable to various connectivity models. So there's almost like a seamless integration of both IoT and security. One of the newest developments that I want to talk about actually follows a multi-layered approach. So on the regular layer model, the developer actually creates a separate layer for threat management in the device itself. And this layer works simultaneously with the network, data, application, and endpoint layers to provide like a stronger security framework that the device can use. This would provide each endpoint device with some form of intrinsic security that's built in rather than a feature that is added on. Now to talk about our solution on the IoT vulnerabilities. So firstly, I would like to say that our solution is kind of a broad amalgamation of like already existing security practices and technologies. So we would like advise the following guidelines through which we believe endpoint security should significantly strengthen. So firstly, utilize security experts all the time. By this, what I mean is through the design, implementation, and deployment phases, constantly consult security experts who are mainly advising reliable and proven security practices. And also test before deployment, so in case there are any bugs or vulnerabilities, it's possible that a developer can catch it. Next up, making security accessible is important to make change in the environment. Security is firstly an extremely specialized field. Not many people can work their way around the technicalities, so experts should make security accessible with ease, especially for those who aren't as experienced. So with more availability in the market, it should increase the overall implementation of the security, which directly correlates to lesser vulnerabilities and so next up we have security awareness. So what I mean by this is enterprises and decision makers should have an array of platforms which they can make use of to increase their knowledge on the importance of security. This should in turn make security more integral to the device rather than just an add-on feature. Press releases, marketing, advertising should start taking security into more consideration, just like all the other features of the device. As a whole, awareness should increase the implementation of security in general, which would decrease the amount of vulnerabilities we have in an IoT environment. So for the course of action, we believe following these specific guidelines should directly increase the strength of security out in the market. providing a more secure form of environment for IoT deployment and standards.